United States immigration crackdown is facing immediate pushback as protests erupt in major cities a day after a deadly clash between ICE officers and civilians in Minnesota. Tensions are rising further with reports of a shooting in Oregon linked to immigration enforcement operations, while ICE officials carry out their mandate. How can illegal immigration be addressed without putting ordinary citizens at risk? And how should the public respond during enforcement actions? Meanwhile, we see that in Burkina Faso, military leader Captain Ibrahim Traoré has survived yet another coup attempt, adding to a series of challenges he has narrowly evaded since taking power. Now, back in the Middle East, Iran is entering its 12th day of widespread protests as citizens rally against a plummeting economy and mounting hardships. Demonstrations are testing the limits of state control and raising questions about the U.S. ability to influence Iran's government to protect civilians. In today's Flash News, we will unpack these stories in detail and explore what they mean for citizens, government, and the balance of power on the international stage. Good afternoon. I'm Tabitha Arko. Let's get started. Tensions over U.S. President Donald Trump is speaking with seeing the protest that is ongoing in Minnesota. And right now, another incident has just happened in Oregon. President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown escalated across the United States on Thursday after two separate shootings involving federal immigration officers in as many days, deepening divisions between state and federal authorities. Protests intensified in Minnesota following the fatal shooting of 37-year-old Renee Copegood by an immigration and customs enforcement officer on Wednesday. State and federal officials offered sharply different accounts of the incident, while Minnesota investigators said they were denied access to evidence and witnesses in the federal inquiry. We see that in a shocking incident, hours later, a U.S. Border Patrol agent shot and wounded two people during a traffic stop in Portland, Oregon. Local officials said they were unable to independently verify the federal government's account of the incident. Let's watch.
We are standing here today united as a state, wanting peace and safety in our communities. We are all shaken and outraged by another terrible, unnecessary, violent event instigated by the reckless agenda of the Trump administration. This time in our own state, in our largest city, coming just one day after the tragedy.
Now, in both cases, Democratic governors and mayors called on the Trump administration to withdraw federal officers who have been deployed to largely Democratic-led cities as part of an expanded immigration enforcement drive. Civil rights groups and Democratic leaders said the operations were inflaming tensions and provoking unrest. Kristi Noem, Homeland Security Secretary, speaking to press, said the shootings were part of a growing pattern in which suspects or activists use vehicles as weapons against officers. Let's take a look.
You know, it's clearly established law that a vehicle driven by a person and used to harm someone is a deadly weapon. Deadly force is perfectly lawful when a threat is faced by a weapon. So I do believe that this officer used his training in this situation, and we'll let the FBI continue the investigation to get it resolved.
In Minnesota, I said Guth right to run over an officer. Community activists countered that video evidence suggests she was attempting to steer away when she was shot. Guth, a U.S. citizen, was taking part in neighborhood patrol, monitoring ICE activity, according to local advocates. In Portland, the Department of Homeland Security said a driver suspected of ties to a Venezuelan gang tried to ram federal agents, prompting an officer to fire in self-defense. Portland police later said two gunshot victims were found about 2 miles away and taken to hospital. With unrest spreading, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz placed the state's National Guard on alert. Hundreds of protesters gathered in Minneapolis, confronting masked federal officers, some of whom used tear gas and pepper balls to disperse crowds. Let's watch.
We do not need any further help from the federal government. To Donald Trump and Kristi Noem, you've done enough. There's nothing more important than Minnesotan safety. I've issued a warning order to prepare the Minnesota National Guard. We have soldiers in training and prepared to be deployed if necessary. I remind you, a warning order is a heads up for folks. And these National Guard troops are our National Guard troops. They're teachers in your community. They're business owners. They're construction professionals. They are Minnesotans. Minnesota will not allow our community to be used as a prop in a national political fight.
Minnesota officials said the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension withdrew from the investigation after federal authorities refused to grant access to evidence or interviews. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said the state lacked jurisdiction. The ICE agent who killed Good was among about 2,000 federal officers deployed to the Minneapolis area in what the administration described as its largest Department of Homeland Security operation to date. The deployment is part of Trump's nationwide immigration crackdown and follows a politically sensitive federal investigation into alleged fraud involving nonprofit groups in the Somali community. Also, Vice President J.D. Vance said the agent had previously been injured after being dragged by a vehicle during an arrest in 2025, an incident that led to a conviction for assaulting a federal officer. Also, bystander video from the Minneapolis shooting shows masked officers approaching Good's car at an angle. As one officer attempted to open the door, the car reversed briefly and then moved forward while turning. Another officer fired 3 shots, including through the driver's window after the vehicle had begun to pass him. It remains unclear whether the car struck the officer. Let's watch. Why you passing it? And from the scene you've just watched, don't lie. You can actually see it and you most probably could testify for yourself. But then what happened in the seconds before Good was killed remains disputed, underscoring the widening divide between federal authorities and state officials over the conduct of immigration enforcement and the use of deadly force. Now, moving over and, of course, bringing you to Iran and the current situation happening with the nationwide protests. Iran's decision to impose a nationwide internet blackout as protests spread across the country reflects a familiar crisis response, one that signals concern not only about public order, but about the durability of state authority amid deepening economic distress. Authorities cut internet and phone services on Thursday evening after demonstrations erupted in Tehran and other major cities. While intended to disrupt coordination and limit global visibility, the blackout failed to fully stem the flow of protest footage, underscoring the declining effectiveness of digital shutdowns and moment of mass arrest. Now, in their second week, protests have reached more than 100 cities, spanning Iran's political, economic, and ethnic fault lines. What began as frustration over inflation and a collapsing currency has widened into direct challenges to the clerical leadership. Chants targeting Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei mark a notable escalation, suggesting that economic grievances are no longer separable from political legitimacy. Now, let's take a look at this video of protesters chanting against the Supreme Leader. As the protest continues, human rights groups report dozens of deaths, widespread injuries, and mass arrests, while state media has acknowledged casualties without comprehensive disclosure. The lack of transparency mirrors a broader breakdown in trust between the state and a population increasingly skeptical of official narratives. Economic pressure remains the central driver. Soaring prices, shrinking incomes, and shortages of essential goods have eroded household stability. The central bank's recent decision to end preferential exchange rates accelerated price spikes, pushing even bizarre merchants long viewed as a stabilizing force aligned with the ruling establishment into open protest. Their participation highlights the extent to which economic hardship has cut across traditional loyalties. Meanwhile, government efforts to ease tensions through limited cash handouts and appeals for shared responsibility have struggled to gain traction. Instead, security deployment have intensified, transforming demonstrations into confrontations. Analysts note that as policy responses narrow, coercion has increasingly replaced reform as a state's primary tool. Protest activity has surged in provinces such as Ilam, Loristan, and Mazandaran, where poverty, ethnic marginalization, and political exclusion intersect. Calls for the removal of the supreme leader, once unthinkable in public spaces, indicates that fear is giving way to a sense of collective risk. The unrest is unfolding amid heightened external pressure, including renewed threats from the United States and lingering regional tensions. While the leadership may frame dissent as foreign influenced, the persistence of protests driven by daily economic realities complicates that narrative. President Trump has issued a warning to Iran if protesters are attacked. Let's take a listen.
I mean, what they've done is in the past, they've started shooting the hell out of people, and all of a sudden people without any weapons whatsoever are standing there and you have machine guns gunning them down, or they take them to prisons and then hang them and kill them. So they played rough, and I said, if they do that, we're going to hit them very hard. Well, we're going to hit them hard. We're ready to do it. If they do that, we're going to hit them hard. And so far, for the most part, there's been some of it, but for the most part, they haven't. There have been people killed. Some of them, the crowds are so big that some of them have had really, were stomped on. Literally, it was terrible. The crowds are just, they're massive. The enthusiasm to overturn that regime is incredible. But there's been people killed, but it's more from death it's literally stomping. It's people running in a certain direction. So we'll see what happens.
Now, despite the scale of unrest, the absence of a unified opposition limits the likelihood of immediate systemic change. Yet, the protests expose a more fundamental strain, a governance system confronting economic collapse, eroding legitimacy, and a population for whom survival concerns now outweigh political caution. The internet blackout in this context is a less temporary security measure than a signal of how narrow the state's remaining Burkina Faso's government says it has foiled an alleged plot to assassinate the country's military leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, in what authorities describe as a coordinated operation involving civilian, military, and foreign actors. Security Minister Mahamadou Sanaa said the plot was planned for the night of January 3rd and what was intercepted by intelligence services shortly before it was to be carried out. He said the plan extended beyond an attack on Traoré and included strikes on key state institutions and prominent civilian figures. Let's take a listen.
In essence, on January 3rd, 2026 at 11 p.m., an attempt to destabilize the country was planned. This was to be carried out through a series of targeted assassinations of civilian and military authorities, starting with the neutralization of Comrade Captain Ibrahim Traoré head of state, president of Faso, either at point-blank range or by an operation to plant explosives at his residence. In essence, on January 3rd, 2026 at 11 p.m., an attempt to destabilize the country was planned. This was to be carried out through a series of targeted assassinations of civilian and military authorities, starting with the neutralization of Comrade Captain Ibrahim Traoré, head of state, president of Faso, either at point-blank range or by an...
According to the minister, the conspirators explored two main options: a direct assault on the head of state or the use of explosive at his residence. Other senior civilian and military officials were also reportedly identified as targets. Authorities further alleged that the plot included plans to destroy a drone base ahead of a possible ground operation. Sana accused former military ruler Paul Henry Damiba of masterminding the operation, alleging that he coordinated funding and recruited participants. Damiba briefly led Burkina Faso in 2022 before being removed from power by Traoré in a coup. The minister also alleged that neighboring Côte d'Ivoire provided financial support for the plot, claiming that 70 million CFA francs were allocated for the operation. Neither Damiba nor the Ivorian government has publicly responded to the allegations. Several suspects have been arrested, including businessman Madi Sakande, whom authorities say admitted to maintaining contact with Damiba. Sana also said investigations are ongoing to identify all individuals involved in the alleged network. The accusations come amid heightened political tension in Burkina Faso, where the military-led government has repeatedly cited security threats and internal conspiracies as it consolidates power following successive coups. Now, this is development coming from Burkina Faso, and still on. Let's look at what is happening with the recent decision, global decision, when it comes to the ceasefire in Gaza. European Union said on Thursday that our efforts are underway to move forward with the second phase of the U.S. brokered ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, as humanitarian conditions in Gaza continue to deteriorate and diplomatic momentum risks stalling. Following talks in Cairo, Egyptian Foreign Minister Badri Abdulati and EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas stressed the need to begin implementing the next phase of the ceasefire without delay. The second phase includes the creation of a Gaza Peace Board tasked with overseeing political transition, security arrangements, and reconstructions. Let's watch.
However, we want more quick movement in the upcoming period, so all the requirements of phase 2 are implemented as soon as possible, while stopping the Israeli daily violations inside Gaza Strip with
Under the U.S. plan, the board would supervise the formation of a technocratic Palestinian administration, oversee disarmament of Hamas, coordinate the deployment of an international stabilization force, manage further Israeli troop withdrawals, and guide post-war reconstruction efforts. The first phase of the ceasefire began in October, shortly after the second anniversary of the Hamas-led attack on Israel that killed about 1,200 people. Since then, nearly all of the 251 hostages taken during the attack have been released, either alive or dead, in exchange for Palestinian prisoners and detainees. Despite the truce, fighting has not fully ceased. Gaza's health ministry says more than 400 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli military operations since the ceasefire began, bringing the total death toll since October 2023 to at least 71,391 as of January 6. Kala said the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains critical, citing restrictions on international non-governmental organizations and the resulting limits on aid delivery. She said the scale of humanitarian access remains far below what is needed. Abdulati said the United States is expected to soon outline details regarding the structure and mandate of the Gaza Peace Board and the proposed technocratic committee. He also reiterated Egypt's opposition to any measures that could further entrench the political separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The talks also addressed the possible resumption of European involvement at the Rafah border crossing. Now, see that the European Union previously played a monitoring role there alongside Israel and the Palestinian Authority under a 2005 agreement designed to facilitate the movement of people and humanitarian aid. Diplomats say progress on the second phase will be critical to sustaining the ceasefire and preventing a renewed escalation as delays risk deepening humanitarian suffering and eroding already fragile trust among the parties. Now ahead and moving over to Syria. In Syria, a report has been unfolding. Syria's defense ministry announced a temporary ceasefire in 3 neighborhoods of Aleppo early Friday, seeking to halt days of intense fighting between government forces and Kurdish fighters that has displaced more than 140,000 people and deepened tensions between Damascus and Kurdish authorities. The truce applies to the neighborhoods of Sheikh Maqsood, Ashrafiyah, and Bani Zaid, where the ministry said armed groups were given a 6-hour window to withdraw. The move followed heavy overnight shelling that set a part of the city ablaze and sent rescue teams scrambling to contain fires. The clashes, now in their 3rd day, reflect a growing rift between Syria's Islamist-led government and Kurdish-run forces that have resisted full integration into the state after more than a decade of war. President Ahmed al-Shara has pledged to reunify the country, but the standoff in Aleppo is testing that goal. Fighting began on Tuesday and has killed at least 7 civilians, according to Syrian authorities. Syrian troops had earlier ordered residents to evacuate Kurdish-held areas and released maps identifying zones that would be targeted alongside imposing curfews in affected districts. Let's take a look. That's a coverage by Al Jazeera. Kurdish forces, including the Syrian Democratic Forces and their internal security wing, the Assassination, said they had repelled government advances. Plumes of smoke were seen rising across Aleppo as artillery fire echoed through the city on Thursday. 2 Syrian officials said that negotiations were underway over a possible Kurdish withdrawal from the city. The positions remain far apart. Damascus maintains that stability cannot be achieved while armed groups operate outside state authority, while Kurdish officials deny requesting safe passage and instead call for government forces to pull back. Let's take a look.
The current escalation occurred yesterday after a recent escalation when the last negotiation round ended here in Damascus between the Syrian delegation and the delegation from SDF. So the SDF forces started to escalate it militarily in the eastern Aleppo countryside.
The United States said it was gravely concerned by the violence and urged both sides to de-escalate. Washington has sought to mediate between the Syrian government and the SDF, though recent talks failed to produce a breakthrough. Also, the European Union continues to indicate their support for Syria to rebuild while establishing good reforms in the face of ongoing security tensions. Let's take a look.
Syria still faces enormous challenges. The clashes in Aleppo over the last days show how fragile the security situation remains. After Assad's fall, the European Union was one of the first, or actually the first one, to ease sanctions to help country to rebuild, but it doesn't only do the trick. Also, investors need to trust the economy, and that's why the reforms on the rule of law are extremely important.
Turkey, which views the U.S. backed SDF as a terrorist organization said it was already ready to assist Syria if asked, and warned that Kurdish control of territory remains a major obstacle to peace. Kurdish leaders and regional officials accused government forces of targeting civilian areas and attempting to alter the demographic makeup of Kurdish neighborhoods. Kurdish authorities said evacuation orders issued ahead of shelling could amount to forced displacement under international law. Kurdish-led administrations established semi-autonomous rule over large parts of northeastern Syria and parts of Aleppo during the civil war. A deal reached last year with Damascus aimed at full integration by the end of 2025, but progress has stalled, with both sides accusing the other of failing to comply. The Aleppo ceasefire now stands as a fragile attempt to contain a conflict that risks unraveling Syria's already tenuous post-war transition. This is development coming from Syria. Until next time, this is where we'll be drawing the curtain on today's Flash News. Remember, we'll bring you Horizon at the top of the hour, 6 p.m. Until then, do have a pleasant day and stay safe.